Right now, somewhere in your body, insulin is knocking on a cell door. And that cell is opening it, letting glucose in, exactly as it should. This happens trillions of times a day, in near perfect silence. But for millions of people, that conversation is slowly changing. The knock gets louder. The door opens a little less easily. And this can go on for a decade before a single test ever notices. Welcome back to Vital Code. Today, we're decoding a mechanism that can build for years before it has a name. This isn't about fear, and it isn't a diagnosis. It's the actual cellular biology behind a process called insulin resistance. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what resistance means at the level of a single cell. Let's decode it. Every time you eat, the same basic sequence plays out. Food is digested, glucose enters your bloodstream, and your pancreas releases insulin to manage it. Insulin's job is to signal cells throughout your body to take that glucose in and use it. This system runs constantly, thousands of times a year, almost entirely without your awareness. For most of human history, it worked exactly as designed. But there's a point where cells can start responding to that signal differently.
Here's why this mechanism matters, even if nothing feels different yet. In insulin resistance, cells become progressively less responsive to insulin's signal. The knock doesn't open the door as easily as it used to. To compensate, the pancreas produces more insulin, working harder to force the same amount of glucose into cells. For years, this compensation can succeed. Blood sugar stays in a normal range because insulin output quietly rises to match the resistance. Which means standard blood sugar readings can look completely normal, even as this compensation is well underway. This is the fuse burning quietly.
To understand why this happens, it helps to look at what this system was built for. Insulin's fat storage function evolved in a world of feast and famine, where storing energy efficiently after a meal was a survival advantage. For most of human history, food scarcity meant this system rarely stayed under constant, continuous demand. Modern life changed the input dramatically. Near constant food availability means near constant insulin signaling. A system built for intermittent demand is now, for many people, running on continuous demand. And continuous demand is exactly where resistance can begin to build. Three components drive this entire mechanism. The pancreas produces and releases insulin in response to rising blood glucose. Insulin binds to receptors on the surface of cells, muscle, fat, and liver cells especially, triggering a signal inside the cell. That internal signal activates glucose transporters, which physically move glucose from the bloodstream into the cell to be used or stored. In insulin resistance, this receptor-to-transporter signaling chain becomes less efficient, even though insulin itself is still binding. The knock is heard. The door just doesn't open as fully or as fast.
Here's the part that makes this mechanism genuinely sneaky. This process typically develops gradually, often over a period of years. As cellular responsiveness declines, the pancreas responds by producing progressively more insulin to maintain normal blood glucose. This compensation can be remarkably effective. For a long time, standard fasting blood sugar tests may show entirely normal results. Meanwhile, insulin levels themselves are quietly climbing to make that normal number possible. The fuse is burning. The smoke just isn't visible on a standard test yet.
This is why insulin resistance is often described as a silent process. Fasting glucose can look completely normal for years because rising insulin output is doing the work of keeping it there.
The gap between a flat glucose line and a steadily climbing insulin line is quite literally this mechanism made visible. Some clinical tools attempt to estimate this gap directly, rather than relying on glucose alone. But widespread routine screening for insulin resistance specifically is less common than standard glucose testing, which means the compensation can be well underway before it's ever formally measured.
Step outside the lab, and this mechanism touches an enormous number of people. Insulin resistance is considered a common, gradually developing process linked to factors like body composition, activity level, and genetics. Many people move through years of this compensation without ever hearing the term applied to them. Understanding the mechanism doesn't mean assuming it applies to you specifically. It means understanding why regular checkups and a fuller picture, not just a single glucose number, matter over time. That's the entire philosophy behind Decode.
Clinical thinking around this has genuinely evolved. There's growing recognition that a single fasting glucose reading can miss the compensation happening upstream of it. Some clinicians now weigh additional markers, like fasting insulin or ratios that estimate resistance directly for a fuller picture. This isn't universal practice everywhere, and testing approaches vary by context and individual risk factors. But it reflects the same mechanism we've been decoding. The gap between glucose and insulin is where the real story lives. Which brings us to what can actually be done about it.
Here's a genuinely hopeful part of this mechanism. Insulin sensitivity is not a one-way street. Cellular responsiveness to insulin can improve. Research has linked factors like regular physical activity, sufficient sleep, and overall dietary patterns to improved insulin sensitivity in many people. Physical activity in particular can increase glucose uptake through pathways that don't rely solely on insulin signaling. That's the promise, a mechanism that responds to change, not just one that quietly worsens. So what does that actually look like in practice?
Here's the honest answer. There's no single food or supplement that reliably reverses this mechanism on its own. What the evidence consistently points to is unglamorous. Regular movement, adequate sleep, and sustainable eating patterns, maintained over time. The mechanism that built up gradually over years tends to respond gradually too, not instantly. This is a conversation to have with your own doctor, especially if you have specific risk factors or concerns. But the underlying biology is genuinely responsive to consistent, ordinary change.
Zoom out, and this isn't just a blood sugar story. The body frequently compensates for gradual internal strain long before symptoms or standard tests reveal anything unusual. This same pattern shows up in areas like blood pressure regulation and other compensatory systems. Insulin resistance is one especially well-studied example of a much broader biological principle. Your body is remarkably good at maintaining normal-looking numbers for as long as it possibly can, which means normal on a single test is valuable information, but it isn't always the complete picture. Understanding that is the real takeaway, far beyond this one mechanism.
So here's the verdict. Insulin resistance isn't a sudden failure. It's a gradual, mechanistic response to years of continuous demand on a system built for intermittent demand. It can build quietly, well ahead of any single abnormal test result. But unlike many hidden processes, this one is genuinely responsive to change. That's not a reason to fear your next blood work. It's a reason to understand what a normal number can and can't tell you, and to stay in conversation with your own doctor about the fuller picture.
So here's what to carry with you. A single normal result is real information, but it's a snapshot, not the whole film. Understanding the mechanism behind it is what turns a routine checkup into an informed conversation with your doctor. If this decoded something you didn't expect, subscribe. There's a hidden mechanism behind almost every number on your chart. We'll keep decoding them, one at a time. Now you know what's actually happening. Vital code.